So the next person is very qualified to the topics we've just discussed. It's my pleasure to introduce Joshua Goldfarb. Joshua comes with hands-on experience in all the spaces we discussed. He's a very veteran cybersecurity analyst with over a decade, years of experience building, operating, and running SOCs with early days experience in the US CERT. And today Joshua serves as the Chief Security Strategist for FireEye, coming to FireEye from Npulse, where he was the Chief Security Officer at Npulse. And Joshua will talk to us about narrative-driven model as an approach to kind of defend ourselves in the future.
Thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. As was mentioned, I come from a very operational background. I only came over to the vendor side a short while ago. Because of that, I'm very sensitive to workflow, to resource constraints, to issues that enterprises face in the security operations and incident response realm. That's where most of my experience lies. Many of the people in FireEye also come from a similar operational background. And because of our experiences, we'd like to share our vision for the narrative-driven model for security operations. This data comes from the M-Trends report, which is available on the FireEye website for free. Anyone can download it. But essentially, at a high level, as we all know, it takes many, many months, 229 days on average, or about somewhere between 8 and 9 months to understand, to learn, to detect, to identify that there's been a breach on a network. And of course, once we detect that there's been a breach, we need to respond to it. We need to perform incident response to understand what's happened, what was the extent of the damage, what's our liability. Questions like that need to be answered. And that process often takes a little over a month, somewhere on the order of 32 days. And of course, each day that goes by costs a lot of money, not only from a sort of liability and legal perspective, but also from a resource perspective. Maybe we need to bring in an outside firm if we're in a security operations environment or an incident response environment, or maybe we have to pay for some technology for a short-term or a long-term period. Whatever the case may be, it can often take quite a bit of money and a long period of time to respond to these incidents. And so while many people show these slides, what I like to do is ask the question, why? Why does it take so long to find this stuff? And why does it take so long to handle it, to perform incident response, to analyze, contain, and remediate? And so in that sense, I had the good fortune of coming right after Aviva, who set me up very nicely, unintentionally. Essentially, she's correct. People are drowning in alerts. As John Naisbitt's famous quote from a little more than 30 years ago, we are drowning in information, but starved for knowledge. We have too many alerts and too little information that we learn from them. So for example, these are fairly straightforward questions. Imagine the police respond to a murder or some sort of a crime scene. They get there, someone's moved the body, or someone took the weapon, it's not there anymore, it's hidden, whatever the case may be. It sounds ridiculous in a physical world analogy, but the truth is that in the security world or in the cyber world, we encounter this all the time. How many times do we try to perform incident response and we discover something happened on a portion of our network where we aren't monitoring or we don't have proper instrumentation? We're essentially flying blind, so to speak. Or perhaps we have a lot of data, but we can't search through it in a reasonable amount of time in order to get the answers that we need. Or perhaps we know the questions we need to ask, but we don't know where to go to get those answers. Right? Or perhaps the data is no longer retained, it's been moved off for whatever reason, and we don't have the ability to perform forensics. And so, although these questions seem very straightforward, how long have I been under attack? How many endpoints are infected? What's the extent of the damage? What data has been taken? right? Is any of it sensitive, proprietary, or confidential? These are all extremely important questions that need to be answered. But in fact, it's very difficult for organizations to answer these questions. And the question I ask again is why? I, along with many people in this room and elsewhere, have a lot of experience in the security operations world, and yet the questions still remain very difficult to answer in a timely period. Well, I would argue that we're living today in what's called an alert-driven security model. As Aviva described and many others have described, it's not uncommon for a workflow to consist of monitoring a queue of alerts. And there may be thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions. And they're of differing quality. Some will be good, some will be bad. But imagine yourself as a 25-year-old analyst, educated, intelligent, analytical, and you're looking through 100,000 alerts on a Tuesday, or a Monday, or a Wednesday, and you pull up an alert and you look at it, and it contains just a moment of time, just what happened in 1 second, and almost no additional context. How do you know if that's a false positive, or if that's the alert that will land you in the newspapers in 3 months? How do you know? Not enough information. That's the problem. There's not enough information. And further, how do you get the information you need in order to build that proper context around that alert in order to make that decision? Well, typically it involves a lot of manual labor, a lot of manual work, where the analyst has to spend hours or sometimes half a day or a full day building the context, building the story around the alert in order to even assess whether it's a false positive, whether it needs to be responded to, whether it's something that needs to be escalated to the management or to the executive level within the company, whether there are notification or liability requirements. The alert-driven model doesn't work. It fails us. We don't have enough information. We don't have enough human resources, people, analysts, to work in this type of environment. We need to move to a narrative-driven model for security. What does a narrative-driven model mean? It essentially means we need to build a narrative or a story or the picture, put the puzzle together. Instead of giving an analyst or an operator one piece of the puzzle and saying, you're a smart person, figure it out. We give them some, most, or all of an assembled puzzle, and we tell them, here's the story as it unfolded, right? That allows the person to make a much more informed decision about how best to respond. Whether something's a false positive, a true positive, but something that's maybe commodity and doesn't need such an acute response, or maybe something that is that event that would have landed them in the newspaper in 3 months, except that now they can handle it in a timely manner. So the data for the pieces of the puzzle comes from a number of different sources. It comes from intelligence, it comes from the network data, right? It comes from malicious code analysis, it comes from endpoint data, it comes from a variety of different sources. We know most of the time the types of queries we need to run by hand to build the context around the alert for those of us that have worked in the enterprise, in the security operations or an incident response role. Well, there's no reason that we as a community can't move to having all that context added automatically when we build the alert into a narrative for the analyst. So as I mentioned, the data for this comes from a variety of different sources, many of which we actually already have or partially have within our enterprises. We need to collect data from the network. We need to collect data from the endpoints. We need to interleave intelligence, bring in intelligence, right? We need to share tactics, procedures, all kinds of techniques. I know Aviva talked a little bit also about some big data, some mining. Those are all valid things that go into building the narrative. They all help us along. And essentially what we can do is, instead of requiring an analyst to perform 9, 10 steps manually after an alert fires, spend 1 hour, 2 hours, half a day putting the narrative together by hand, there's no reason we can't give the narrative to the analyst in a reduced, efficient queue of narratives instead of alerts, and tell the analyst, now that you have the whole puzzle, you tell me, Is this good or is it bad? Thank you.